Welcome to Design Emergency Podcast. I'm Alice Rawsthorn, co-founder of Design Emergency with Paolo Antonelli, and we're delighted that our guest for this episode is the architect Jeanne Gang. Jeanne will discuss how she and her colleagues at Studio Gang are designing new ways of reusing and repurposing existing buildings as an ecologically responsible alternative to building new ones. Jeanne is a remarkably prolific and ingenious architect and urban designer. Her work at Studio Gang, which is based in Chicago, where she was born, with offices in New York, Paris, and San Francisco, includes the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts, the Gilder Center for Science Education and Innovation at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and the Tom Lee Park in Memphis, Tennessee. Among her projects currently being designed or under construction are the new US Embassy in Brasilia and the Global Terminal at Chicago O'Hare Airport. Jeanne has described the defining theme of her work as being to make architecture that strengthens kinship among people, their communities, and the natural world, and that fosters interaction and connection rather than developing standalone objects. All her work is steeped in her research at Studio Gang and as a professor in practice at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where her teaching focuses on the theories of reuse and resilience that she explores in her latest book, The Art of Architectural Grafting. So, Jeanne, what is architectural grafting?
It's really just an approach, and it's an approach to reusing architecture that's really about maximizing the carbon savings by using the original structure and taking advantage of the qualities it has to add something new. It's really closely tied conceptually to horticultural grafting, which does the same thing for plants.
And what convinced you to introduce it to your practice, and what have the benefits been of doing so?
Well, it was really trying to find more of a framework for this practice that was ongoing in our own work, but I've also seen in other people's work, kind of developing more robust taxonomies and fresh metaphors that could help fuel the imagination and just bringing some more intellectual heft to the subject. I was a bit weary of the words, I guess, reuse, adaptive reuse, recycling, all of these things that just are used for everything and that doesn't have architectural meaning. So that's really why the grafting terminology got interesting to me. Then in our own practice, it was really about, maybe started when in 2012, when there was this amazing building in Chicago by Bertrand Goldberg as the Prentice Women's Hospital. The owner of the building was planning on tearing it down. And because they needed more area on that site, they needed to expand their facilities. They were hemmed in, so there was really a legitimate need for more space. But they never considered reusing this building in any way. Of course, if it was up to historic preservation, it would have been preserved indefinitely as it was. So it was really about thinking through how could we find this third way where we could get the owner the space that they need, but not by tearing down what's already there, and especially this building, which is really iconic for Chicago architecture. So it was about adding capacity to an existing building. As we were looking for this third way, what was really interesting about that building specifically was it was this kind of cloverleaf concrete structure, brutalist style, and it had a lower base and then this cloverleaf piece. And so, and one of the things that was really a big discovery when we started looking at it was that the center of the cloverleaf, the center of the building, was actually open. There wasn't a core in the center, and that was because the way that Bertrand designed it was to have an open center so the nurses that would be sitting there could see all the rooms. But what that did was it left this big opportunity for inserting a new core into the center of the building. Like you could imagine growing a new building through the middle up on the top. And that's what we did. It wasn't a project where owner was our client. This was a self-initiated project to just try to go through the thought experiment of how you might graft onto the Prentice Women's Hospital. And so working together with an engineer to make sure it was possible, we came up with this idea of growing this new tower out, starting in the center and growing on up out of the building. So that was kind of in 2012, that was like the first time I really thought of it as a graft, as a grafted, almost like plant-like structure.
And how has grafting developed since then? You're one of a number of leading architects to have adopted it in different ways. Lacaton and Vassal in France, for example, who you mention in your book, and David Chipperfield Architects, which recently persuaded the London School of Economics to allow it to repurpose an existing building rather than to demolish and replace it. Given the enormity of the ecological threats we face and the scale of the environmental damage caused by conventional architecture and construction techniques, how significant can architectural grafting be in helping us to address the climate emergency?
Well, I think it can be very significant because we need all the strategies that are out there all at once. But typically, renewing existing buildings saves about 50 to 75% of the embodied carbon. And by that, I mean, of course, the carbon emissions that come from the materials in the building and the getting the materials to the building. And so that means that grafting is really something that is a significant strategy. And so the other thing that's really interesting is that if you compare all the different ways of renovations, and renovation actions, one of the best way to save emissions is to increase the capacity and the intensity of use of the buildings that we already have. So a really good significant amount of data came out of the European Union and along with guidelines of how to compare greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the things that is discovered there in this, trying to get to a circular economy, is that this increasing the capacity is one of the best ways. Probably delaying any building demolition is the best way. It's listed as the best way, and then increasing capacity of use is second best way. Of course, all of these other strategies that go down the line, the idea of designing for disassembly, we've heard people talk about that. But the problem of that one is that you don't save the carbon emissions until those materials are disassembled and then reused again in a new building. So you have to wait for that savings. And the problem is, as you said, it's an emergency and we need to do the things that save the carbon emissions right now. So that means that this idea of grafting is really relevant for the moment. Other architects, Lacaton, Vassal, have done a lot. And as you mentioned, David Chipperfield, other architects are also working on this issue. And I think it's going to take all of us.
And could you talk us through 2 examples of Studio Gang's projects that have embraced grafting so we can visualize exactly what the impact is?
The one that really exemplifies for me is a kind of museum and art center in Little Rock, Arkansas, where when we came in, there were about 8 different buildings that had been built over time and with no real rhyme or reason, and just a kind of organically grown. And really the result, when we looked at this building for the first time, it really was very, let's just say, ugly. I mean, aesthetically unpleasing, because there were so many different styles and different things going on, and the circulation was really confused. So for the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts, it was a strategy of kind of finding a place where you could edit and create a very good flow of movement through the building, and adding the things that they didn't have that they needed, like the social spaces that make a museum really work, a cultural living room, a restaurant, and adding on to their existing galleries, like adding an additional floor onto the galleries using the same structure, and then increasing the capacity of their school, they have an art school as well. So all of those things were kind of the internal improvement of the circulation and bringing more capacity to it, and then adding these social functions and more gallery space. And then what we tried to do was get it into kind of a cohesive language that could, make it feel like an institution, and then and give some rules that would even make it possible for someone to add something on again in the future. And that was the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts. I think another example that I really like is the Beloit College Powerhouse. It was a coal burning power plant in Beloit, Wisconsin. We like to call it Bellois in French, just for fun. But it was it was a power plant that was, very dirty fuel burning, but it was closed down because of that. And, this is a classic city where there's like the town and gown. There's the city center it was an industrial town, and then the hill with the academic institution on the hill. And this power plant was right between the two. And so it was like a perfect opportunity to both reimagine the power plant as a new function for the college. Like they needed a health center, they needed a recreation center, and a kind of student union space. But at the same time, imagine it as something that could link the two between the town and gown, almost like a machine for accessibility on the river that would bring this hilltop down to the level of river and connect over to the city. So it was about, reusing this building, this big building, but adding onto it this accessibility aspect and function, as well as a big new space. According to the logic of this original power plant, it was added on to the east, just like all of its additions had been going along. And it was like, really, it's such a generous big building that you wouldn't be able to have if you started from scratch. And they got 3 programs, in it instead of building 3 buildings. And the city got something back, and the riverfront got something back. So it was just a kind of a great story about how grafting can really bring new life. And even not only just bringing new life, if you didn't do this to this building, you could imagine the kind of emptiness, or how long it would sit there empty, because just tearing something like that down is a big job in and of itself, and probably wouldn't happen. So you would have this kind of gap, or a derelict part of the city that would really prevent it from growing. So in a way, it like needed it so much to really help the city continue.
Which, given that so many of our towns and cities are blighted by derelict or decrepit relics, it's a very germane point. One of the things I loved about the book were your examples of historic projects that had involved grafting and contemporary ones by other architects. So similarly, could you talk us through a couple of those?
Yeah, I think it's really nice to be able to put this lens on some past projects. And one of the architects I think is so relevant for right now is looking at the work of Carlos Scarpa, who, of course, was working in a war-torn area during his career after the war, World War II. He had a lot of rebuilding to do, but instead of just wiping things out, he was able to reuse and reinvent some of the even more ancient architecture. I love the project, the Castel Vecchio, which is it's actually a combination of buildings that were built over time, but uniting them with this new language of steel and display, and turning this into just the most fantastic museum that's full of surprises. By working with what was already there as much as he could, but just inserting enough that it feels like something fresh and new. Floor surfaces, walls, display, partitions, doors, stair steps, all of these elements that suddenly make this place feel like just a new surprise around every corner, and with light coming in the right places, and compositions of these elements that it couldn't be like that if you started from scratch. It just wouldn't be possible. So something like that is taking architecture that's old, but maybe not significant in terms of its pedigree, but uniting it with a new tactic. I think a contemporary practice that is so good at grafting, even though I don't think they've called it that, but what they do is so amazing, is the Lecatan Basel and the work they've done with housing, where public housing, which the knee-jerk reaction is always to just rip it down and blame, the expenditures on the public realm, and socialist policies for how bad public housing can be. But what they did was so brave, because they were asked to do new public housing, and instead of tearing down the building, they proposed grafting onto it, really, new spaces that made it much more livable. It really is a graft, because the way that they utilized all the existing structure, but thought of it as a positive, a benefit, that a new kind of, like with horticultural grafting, it's like about, getting tastier fruit, or getting a new kinds of flowers or blossoms on an existing rootstock that is very strong and hardy. And that's just what they did, because they added like these spaces, like winter gardens, for people to use on the exterior of the building. So they were framing into the existing structure and really making these new forms of lifestyle possible.
Well, they're fantastic examples, because they are both magical in very different ways. The theatricality of Scarpa's museum and the sort of extraordinary, humane, engaging qualities of Lacton and Vasal's housing. Now, you have made a brilliant case for grafting, but are there instances where it simply wouldn't make sense to include it?
The basic principle, my motto, start with what's there. That applies, because even if there is no building, there's always something there. It could be the land, the ecology. It could be a custom that exists around a place. It could be the soil. There's always something that is there. So I think that's really just a good starting point. Not necessarily grafting, because I don't want to throw everything into the definition. But I do think it's a great way to just practice, is to look around and see what's valuable, what can be utilized. And these could be invisible things too. But in terms of grafting, there's always excuses, of course. There's excuses about it's too expensive, or it takes too much labor, or it's impossible, or it's doesn't meet code. A lot of those things can be addressed. They really can. But potentially, there are times when it might not make sense, because there's a new structure needed. There's nothing on the site. There's there might be nothing to work with in terms of structure, which is the main point of this book. But I think that there's always something to connect with, in terms of making the project richer and better. And it might not be an opportunity to save carbon, but there's always a chance to connect with culture, connect with the land. So I think it's just a good principle to start with. And usually we start with every single project like that, trying to find out, maybe it's just a resource, like the people themselves that are committed to something, and how can you, tap into that. And I think of our project in Memphis, where Townley Park, and There was really nothing there except for a dike along the Mississippi River. It's just artificial land. But what's interesting is like there are people there and they have dreams, and how do you tap into what they want to see there. And so in that project, we really just, connected with a lot of community groups, youth, and tried to determine what would work. It wasn't a project plopped in from, outer space, or like, oh, I think it would be really great to have a Ferris wheel there or something. It wasn't like that kind of thing. It was really more like people said, we want everyday programs. Like we want to have music, we want to play basketball, we want bathrooms and food. And it's kind of like, so we just took these everyday programs that people really expressed that would make me come down there. If I knew that there was something I could, get to drink, if I knew there was a restroom. And so we just took these everyday things and found a way to bring them to this incredible site on the river and elevate them so that you feel like you're in a special place, but working with what people really said that they wanted. So even when there was no structure there, I think of that as a kind of form of grafting. It's a kind of an urban and cultural type of grafting.
And what are the external catalysts that have enabled you to embrace architectural grafting and to continue your experiments with it, whether they're scientific, cultural, or legislative changes or advances in technology?
Well, I think there's really a big push to obviously reduce carbon, at least in in the EU, we see it in legislation that we have to prepare for and to understand the carbon that's going into our buildings and have strategies for how to reduce that. And so those new enactments that are coming online are really causing everyone to think about this. So that's an external catalyst that really is allowing us to embrace it. I also appreciate that those legislations and restrictions also are causing innovation with technology and tools. So for example, there's much better tools to measure what you already have. If you're thinking about grafting something onto something that exists, you have to be able to scan it and understand it very detailed, because there's a precision to these connections that you make on the very tectonic scale and load transfer scales. So there's great new tools in this area. I'm really excited about tools such as 3D printing that might be able to help us make those transitions between one type of structure and the next. So you have the ability to what is called in horticultural grafting an interstock graft. It's when you can't join exactly one plant to another plant. You need something in between the two so they can talk to each other. And that seems to be like something that is almost within reach right now in terms of technology and tools. Of course, there are challenges also that are, besides some of the ones that I already mentioned. I think one of the challenges for architects ourselves, even though we see a lot of architects embracing this, one of our hindrances is that we have learned that architecture is like a work of art that is finished. And then even if you have a project where you're adding onto something and putting maybe your mark, then you think it's finished. But in fact, we have to completely change that mindset and think of, and this is where I think it's maybe it's more challenging for architects, but for me, it's really exciting and it opens a lot of possibilities that, that this is an evolving work. It's not done ever. And so you could even use that to help set up how you design your added capacity, your graft, so that it could be grafted again. And that I think that would blow some people's mind because, we're taught in school, it's like the authorship is the authorship. So this is going to require us to collaborate with, maybe people who are already gone and imagine what they might have wanted to do or what they had in mind. but also it's this asynchronous collaboration that I think is really interesting. So, so we also have to think about in the future, like how might someone have an opportunity to add on to this again?
And how have clients' attitudes towards architectural grafting changed? Has it become easier to convince them?
It's interesting because I think it can be difficult if they have something in their head already about getting rid of the building that's on site. And so it's in the state side, you have that challenge of just people wanting new, this whole concept of obsolescence, which applies to designed objects maybe, but buildings, it should not be applied to buildings. Maybe some of the systems are obsolete, but those can be changed out, and we need to think of the building as more a continuity. So on the state side, you have a lot of desire to get some new building and not consider the old. On the Europe side, we see more dedication to preservation and resistance to adding on something new, or making it like there would be openness to reusing something or changing the use, but not so much to changing the architecture. And that goes back to that authorship thing and that desire to preserve that authorship. So there are different challenges by both sides from the client side. But I think that many people see the value of the kind of the character that is brought forth by keeping something. Hopefully they will continue to learn more about why the carbon advantages are as well.
Why did you decide to write a book about it?
Well, that was mainly because, there's just a need to have more, to be able to talk about this type of work in a more precise manner, to make more opportunities for other architects to be able to, become creative about it and to think of their work in a different way, to also give architects maybe some ammo if they're trying to convince one of their clients. But really it was mostly to increase the dialogue about it, increase the amount of the kind of just introducing new fresh metaphors that can be exploited in different ways, really just to be useful for others and to also get it down on paper, the thing that I've been working on for a while.
And you've conducted and are conducting other experiments and designing ways of making the built environment more sustainable. So bird-safe building techniques, for example, steeped in your love of bird watching, and the experimental prairie ecosystem on the roof of your Chicago office. How are they developing?
Oh yeah, it's really as you practice and you discover things. I think that the issue about bird safety in buildings was one of my very first projects that I was, working on a nature center and working with some ornithologists and realized that very early this is, a very big problem, especially for cities on migratory pathways. And learning that, even in the States, something more like almost like 1 billion birds die every year with collisions with glass. So ever since I learned about this issue, I've been incorporating methods for making buildings bird safe and bird friendly, which has taken, experimentation really literally on my own place and on my offices, and working together with ornithologists to understand how birds see, which is different than humans, and what the most dangerous situations are. And again, it's like something that it's a complex problem, but the solutions are not that complex. You just have to be aware of where those problems can be so you can address it in those places. And I often tell people, that ask me what to do, even other architects, like, I just designed this house in the mountains and birds are crashing into it like crazy. And I will help them to come up with strategies. So I think I need to write this stuff down. Also, it is available for people to understand, but it is a little bit difficult of an issue to get the nuance of it. And I think because I love birds and watching birds and see how they behave, I understand it pretty well. But so that's just something that we incorporate in all of our projects, unless unfortunately someone like decides to pull it out of the project, which has happened as well. But that's going along well. I think there's more awareness. I'm working on always with other groups, partnering to work on legislation. And 2 cities that we've worked on New York City and San Francisco, both have legislation in place. My own city, Chicago, still not yet, but we're working on it. And so I think it's that advocacy for things like that is a long-term project, but it's just something I'm passionate about, as well as biodiversity, and in that case, biodiversity in cities. So you need places for habitat, not just for humans, and buildings are a perfect place to provide that on their rooftops. So we've been working with our own rooftop and designing that so that it's a very good place for pollinators, birds, and even we have bats and bees also. So we have been increasing our biodiversity and measuring that every year. And then we've helped a few other people in our neighborhood do the same. So we're kind of creating this little corridor space. And I think that kind of project, yeah, it can get so much greater in scale when even if it's just, one rooftop, and then it becomes 2, and then it becomes 4 in a row. And it's like, it becomes, our rooftop has actually been designated as a floristic habitat, which is a high quality habitat now. So it's pretty cool. Yeah. And now, from the book, we are advancing on an experimental forest, which, if you're using grafting as an idea, you need lightweight materials to add onto existing buildings. That means we need wood, bio-based materials. And so we're trying to work with partners and match up these needs and gaps, and a perfect opportunity to make a solution of growing some timber, wood, in polluted sites using phytoremediation to clean the sites, but then providing some wood product for the building industry right near Chicago, where all the building materials are needed, near a city, instead of shipping wood halfway across the country for construction. So those are kind of ongoing experiments and research projects that are intended to one day be scaled up. And the way we do that is by working with partners that can think about it from all the different angles.
And very quickly, what are a few practical examples of the changes you've made to the design of buildings in order not to endanger birds?
Oh, for birds, there's some very easy things to do. One is, if you can think about it, the critical area is like from the tree line, the top of the trees down, because that's where, so if you're doing a tower, you don't have to do this all over the entire tower, but the birds are coming in for the habitat, the trees in the city, or plants that people put inside. Don't do that behind clear glass, but fritted glass works great if you can do that. For people that are just, have a house that are having this problem, you can do things like, if you find out which part is the problem, maybe it's a corner where it looks like you can fly through there, you can put a bird feeder right next to the building. And that sounds counterintuitive, but when they see the feeder, they will slow down for that. Or you can treat the glass on that corner. So, and one of the biggest dangerous areas are when you have a fly-through area where you have two, like a bridge with glass on both sides. They just can't see that. So you need to treat the glass, preferably on the exterior side of it, with a pattern, not just a bird sticker that doesn't work, but you need a pattern that's about, dots at least 2 centimeters-ish apart, which you can get with some afterwards. You can have it etched into the glass. It's becoming more and more affordable to get done. You can apply an adhesive on the outside that will eventually need to be reapplied. But like, there's all different strategies with different price points that are effective.
Well, I should start analysing things from a bird's perspective in future. So back to architectural grafting, how do you expect it to evolve going forward?
Oh, I think that, looking at bigger parts of cities, as you mentioned earlier, blighted parts of cities, how can we re-engage those parts of and think of them by incorporating what already exists? Thinking about big infrastructure projects, like underground parking garages, and what to do with that. I'm thinking of La Défense in Paris, where there's not going to be as many cars, and so what could this be? And I think people are starting to think about that. That's really great, but not to rip it out, or why would you? Or even above ground parking structures, can they be inhabited in new, exciting ways? That was one of the assignments I gave my students at Harvard. And amazing things came out of that. So I think there's a lot of building typologies that you would normally not consider. So these are more the anonymous ones than the very cool, iconic ones. But all of them are like little nuggets of carbon that can be reimagined for the future.
And finally, what changes need to be made by architects, clients, contractors, politicians, and so on for grafting to achieve its full potential? And what gives you hope that this will happen?
Education about it, for number one, but there's a need for legislation to set the rules of the game. I mean, every city is, and every country is going to need to reduce their carbon emissions. And so we just need that in place, because it's easy to have good intentions, but then when it gets down to the nitty gritty, a lot of times those get abandoned, and you need to have a reporting necessary. I really believe that. I think with clients, maybe this communication of great examples and starting to think about it as this grafting idea can also help get clients inspired to think about, wow, I never thought my building, my ugly concrete building, could be reused for something. And maybe, it's really just a matter of, igniting the imagination in some cases.
Well, Jeanne, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation and for being so generous in sharing your vision of architecture and architectural grafting with us. And thank you all for listening. You can find images of some of the projects that Jeanne has mentioned on our Instagram feed at design.emergency. And in the hope of making Design Emergency more accessible, we've added alt text for people with impaired vision to our posts and a transcript of Jeanne's interview, which you can access on the link in our bio. We look forward to welcoming you back to Design Emergency soon, when we'll be talking to another global design leader who, like Jeanne Gang, is helping to build a better future. Goodbye.